So it all started, as many ideas that I have these days do, with a scrolling through Twitter over breakfast whenever I caught sight of a tweet by Oliver where he shared this little graphic. The idea behind this is to represent the role that what is referred to here as the external memory field plays in helping us to generate ideas and to assimilate that in and interact with our long-term memory. Our working memory is limited in its capacity, and for us then to be able to outsource some of the thinking that we're doing in what Oliver's referring to here as our extended mind is an important process in helping us in this generative process of coming up with ideas and assimilating them into what we already know. That graphic was very good. So we got into a little bit of conversation, and Oliver wrote this. This is an illustration of Merrill Donald's external memory field providing the necessary permanent capture of thoughts. The necessary permanent capture of thoughts. So in other words, the limitations on our working memory means that sometimes the thoughts we have in there can be quite fleeting. We need to be able to capture them permanently in some form like this, in our extended mind, the external memory field, in order to support the thinking process of our working memory. So he talks about the necessary permanent capture of thoughts, and then this one's the one that really caught my eye too. To reflect back to you and cause iterative improvements. Because whenever I sit down with a piece of paper like this, I love to sketch out and try to come up with my ideas and make these connections. Very often the first time I do it, it isn't quite right, it isn't the best format, and that process then is a process of iteration, of trying it over and over again, different ways of doing it until the sense begins to emerge from what I'm doing. So he talks about this necessary permanent capture of thoughts to reflect back and to cause iterative improvements. And it got me thinking about GIS mapping in the process of iterative improvements. So what I want to do in this video is basically just to reflect something of the thoughts that I've had in response to it. This is maybe the start of a thinking process, and it'll invite maybe a little bit of dialogue and discussion if it prompts some thinking for you. So we're going to do this through the context of a Choropleth map. A Choropleth map is a shaded map which represents values in space. It's a very, very common way of mapping. And if you go onto Twitter and just do this, you will see lots and lots of examples of Choropleth maps. Now, you will see that pretty much every single version that you will find on Twitter has been drawn using a mapping software. I actually Googled hand-drawn Choropleth maps and couldn't find any. And the reason why I Googled that is because in the geography classroom and in the geography exams, very often the process of drawing these Choropleth maps is a process of literally drawing it with pencils and colouring pencils. And hence the reputation that geography teachers sometimes have that all we do is colouring in. Now, I am not knocking colouring in. A long, long time ago, I did A-level art. I think that doing a little bit of artistic expression is tremendously therapeutic. And to sit and get the colouring pencils out and to produce a lovely revision poster is a wonderful experience, and I'm absolutely not knocking that. But the process that you go through whenever you are doing this is not really so much an iterative process, because whenever you have produced this by hand, whenever you've shaded it by hand, it is what it is. The iterative process is really deciding on your scale and your key and your groups and things like that. But once you've produced the map, it is what it is. But what if when you produce that map, it's maybe just not quite the best way to present the information? Back to what I mentioned here earlier. Whenever I go about making my own pieces of paper or make my own maps on piece of paper, I'm brainstorming on a piece of paper like this, it is an iterative process. It is very, very unusual that I will land on the final version the first time. And that iterative process, as Oliver says, is a vital part of the whole process of pulling this together. So how does the use of GIS in producing mapping help on that iterative process. Okay, so well, here are my initial thoughts. There's a little exercise I'm working on with my GCSE pupils at the moment, and we're looking at the issue of globalization. So what I got them to do was to go around their homes and find locations of items that they had, and they'd filled in a little mapping survey for me, which plotted them on the map of the world. Now, I want them to see patterns, and that process is aided in terms of its iterative nature when we use GIS. Let's have a wee look and see how. Now, when you look at this map, you can probably see something of the pattern already beginning to emerge. That there is a lot of our, there are a lot of our products that come from Europe, a lot of our products that come from Asia, none really from Africa or South America, at least in our survey, and a few from North America. So there's definitely a spatial pattern there. But are there ways that we can make that spatial pattern even more apparent? Well, yes, there are. We can put on a flowline map. Now, the GIS map will draw this for you. It takes a few steps, but it will draw this for you. Again, this is a way of doing this that shows how this can be an iterative process. That already improves it. You're already seeing the connections there in a way that wasn't quite as apparent as before. But we can carry on in this iterative process because I can adjust this slightly. Let's say we come in here. This is only showing the location. So let's just say that I want to show this as the number of items. So I'll turn these into proportional lines. Now notice again, this is an iterative process. I am able to experiment with this and say, right, does that show the patterns even better? Yeah, I think it definitely does. Look at that. Look at the thickness of the line that's coming there. But I can do it again. I can carry on with the iterative process, because what if I want to actually mark on the continents like that? I'll do that. And what we're seeing now is, if I turn on this legend, the thickness of the line representing the volume of the flow, but then the continents. Which continents are dominating? And again, one of the things that I can do with this, if I want to filter this, I can put on a filter. And I can go continent is Asia. I can apply that filter. Again, as part of the iterative process, I can see all of the lines that are coming from Asia and Asia alone. Now again, what you can see with this is because we're constructing and reconstructing again, this is the process of iteration that is helping us to increasingly grasp something of the meaning of this map. There's them all back on again. So we can take this further again and we can have a look at maybe some of the reasons that can explain that pattern again in an iterative process. Let's take a look at that. So what I can then do is to put on another layer of one of the factors that helps explain that, and that's the percentage in each country employed in manufacturing industry. I can put on the layer. There's your Choropleth map. Now, is that the best way of visualizing the data? Is that a way that makes the patterns stand out as well as they might? Let's turn on the legend and see. The color scheme that is defaulted to there is perhaps not quite as clear as we might want it to be. So again, I can come in and carry on in that iterative process. I can come in and make the adjustments on this. So I want to adjust the colors. So I'm going to change that to above and below. This is less about how I go about doing this. So if I'm going so fast that you're not seeing what I'm doing, don't worry about it. This is more about the iterative process. I can experiment. Right. Well, I quite like that. I think that's probably going to show the patterns a little bit better. So let's click OK. Right. Now, what I'm seeing here in this is that the cooler colors have more people employed in manufacturing. The warmer colors have slightly less. But again, we can do this as an iterative process. I can start to drag these around a little bit to see what it is that's going to make the pattern stand out best on this map. So what I'm really wanting to do is to get that so that there is a clear difference between sub-Saharan Africa and Asia in terms of the color scheme that's coming through. But I can iterate that. What I want to do is have the reds and the yellows dominating in Africa and the blues and the greens dominating in Asia. And that iterative process, in that case, China and India are a little bit too close together. So I wonder if I move that up a little bit, can we separate them out? It's a bit too much. Pull that back down again. And we're beginning to see a little bit of the difference. We'll pull it down a little bit more. There's that iterative process going on. And you can experiment with that over and over again to try and see what is the best thing to get that pattern to emerge. And there we go. So what we're beginning to see, and I'll just actually change the base map in this one because the topography map is fighting a little bit with those colors, so I can simplify that down again. There's another iterative process. The patterns are becoming clearer and clearer and clearer. What we're seeing here is that the lines are coming from countries that tend to be the blues. Remember, look at the legend. That's the countries that have most employed in manufacturing industry, and the continents that are represented least. Sub-Saharan Africa has the fewest. Those patterns coming through yet again through that iterative process. So let's take a look at one final aspect of this and how we can bring in some information about the GDP per country to help explain this. So I turn that layer on. I've already been through an iterative process with this one, so let me just show you what I've done with this. There's the colors and the sizes. So if I click on that, I want to change the size and experiment a little bit with the size for this. So as I move that around, you can see how I can experiment with the sizes of those circles. Again, that iterative process, what is it that best represents the countries in the world that have the highest GDP? So that process of just iteratively moving that around allows me to make some decisions about the best way of doing that. And then once that's done, I can then put on the layers again of our proportional lines. And you can see the relationship between the countries that have the larger GDPs and the amount of products that we've got from them. And then I can put this layer back on again. Now, that begins to fight with it. It's looking really complicated, isn't it? So what we maybe want to do in this iterative process is to reduce the opacity of that a little bit. So bring that down so that we get a hint of what's there in the background. You can still see that. So it hasn't disappeared entirely. We're still outsourcing it. We're not having to hold that information in our working memory, but we're going through that iterative process of trying to see how best to present this data. Maybe something like that works well. And what we now have is a really sophisticated thing that just started with some dots, that we've gone through this iterative process of adding on the flow lines, we've added on the Choropleth map, we've added on the proportional symbols maps, we've changed the colors, we've changed the size, but we did this as an iterative process. Now that compared to handing out a hand-drawn map to our pupils, an outline map, and saying, grab your colouring pencils and colour that in. Which one, number one, is better geography? Which one, number two, leads to richer, deeper, more generative learning? Interesting questions to ponder. And all of that from a random tweet over breakfast this morning.